Is fertility treatment a solution to population decline? This panel discussion is taking place thanks to the generous support of Merck. Fertility, in the sense of the total fertility rate, which is the average number of children born to a woman over her lifetime, is decreasing steadily, both globally and within most countries. And newspapers and news websites regularly feature articles addressing the different elements of this decline. In fact, this morning, as I was doing my walk, listening to Radio 4's Today programme, there was an item about the maternity unit at the Royal Free Hospital in North London closing due, they said, to falling birth rates. They said that birth rates had fell in that area by 14% in the last 5 years. But it seems that, I don't know whether it's because I'm alert to this issue, perhaps like many of you on this call, but you just keep seeing these things over and over again. So just last month, the New Yorker ran an article, The Apocalyptic Decline in Birth Rates. Last year, the Lancet ran an article entitled Dramatic Declines in Global Fertility Rates Set to Transform Global Population Patterns by 2100. And then this one over here, which if you look at the date, you can see it's from March 2024. It sat on my desk all that time because it just sort of intrigued me. And I just thought, gosh, the Times magazine leads with this on a picture of a baby on its front cover, rather than what I'd rather see, which would be the Easter chocolate recipes. In BioNews last year, we covered the stats that came out from the Office of National Statistics, which showed that fertility rates have fallen now to their lowest in the UK since World War II, which is quite something. Our first speaker is Professor Geeta Nargund. She is the lead consultant for reproductive medicine at St George's University Hospitals, and she is medical director of Create Fertility and ABC IVF. She is the co-founder and medical advisor at Ginsberg Women's Health Board, and she was the UK medical expert to the recent Economist Impact Report, Fertility Policy and Practice, a Toolkit for Europe. She's the co-editor of the book Development of In Vitro Maturation for Human Oocytes and contributor to the handbook Current and Novel Protocols for the Treatment of Infertility, and also the book Ovarian Stimulation. And finally, as if that's not enough, she's also a member of the fertility regulator in the UK, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority.
Decline in population or the decline in birth rate is influenced by many factors, as we all know, such as cultural shifts, economic barriers, and also changing social norms. And the implications of a demographic shift can be very large, leading to an aging population and putting pressure on public services, pressure on pensions, and the economy in general. So since I'm the first speaker, I'll just go through some key definitions that are relevant to today's discussion. Total fertility rate, which Sarah has already mentioned, which is the number of children that would be born to a woman if she were to live to the end of her childbearing years and bear children in accordance with age-specific fertility rates of the specified year. Replacement rate is the total fertility rate at which women give birth to enough babies to sustain population levels, which stands at 2.1 now, but it assumes no net migration. Then fertility gap is the gap between intended or desired fertility and actual fertility. And old age dependency ratio is the ratio of the population aged 65 years or older to the population aged 16 to 64. So we are looking at economically active population. So let's look at UK data. So looking at the latest Office for National Statistics data, in the UK, the total fertility rate has hit the lowest level since records began, and it's just at 1.44 births for women at the moment. The number of children born is the lowest since 1977. Deaths have outnumbered births for the first time in 50 years. That's excluding deaths due to COVID. And if we look at all families in the UK, in 2023, majority had only one child, only 14% had 3 or more children. The UK currently has a fertility gap of 0.3 children, meaning for every 3 children wanted, only 2 are born. So if we look at our population, aging population, currently 2 out of 5 people in the UK are over the age of 50, and 1 in 5 are aged 65 and over. And that's expected to grow from 12 million to 22.1 million by 2072. And if we look at economically active population, there are around 3.6 working age people per pensioner, and it is predicted to fall to 2.5 working people per pensioner in the next few years. So this is the data that's extremely worrying. As Sarah said earlier, I was fortunate enough to be part of the expert panel for the Economist Impact research work, as well as the publication that came out in October last year. And the Economist Impact wanted to produce this toolkit to help governments, and many governments across the world, including in Europe, have recognized the importance of working on this particular topic in the long run. So I'll just go through that one, because that particular research did good work as regards to doing impact rating. So as regards to fertility direct impact rating, it was rated like this: 1 star if there were no studies available or no evidence on the direct impact on total fertility rate, and 2 stars if there are 1 or 2 studies that identified an increase on TFR and with no negative impact. 3 stars if we had at least 3 to 4 studies that identified small long-term increase in fertility rate or larger and short-term increase in TFR. And 4 stars were given if we had 5 studies identified of a long-term increase in TFR, and 5 stars if there were more than 5 studies available. So that was a good impact rating based on the available papers. I must point out at this stage that not all of them were systematic reviews. So if we look at this rating that was done, which I believe is quite an important one, and all policy areas were looked at. As we all know, when it comes to fertility, when people make decisions to have children, all these matter. Childcare policies, workplace policies, financial policies, and assisted reproduction policies. So childcare policies, particularly increasing childcare availability, rated with 4 stars, with quite strong impact directly on fertility rate, as well as economic impact, which is return on investment for our government, as well as the well-being of people, societal as well as individual well-being. But if we look at currently what's happening in the UK, a nation that is the 6th largest, has the 6th largest economy, UK is actually the 4th most expensive country when it comes to childcare. So clearly that needs to be addressed if we really want to get that impact, fertility rate impact, as well as economic return on investment. When it comes to workplace policies, introducing longer maternity leave and introducing higher paid maternity leave had much stronger impact when it came to fertility rate impact. And there are a number of case studies from European countries to show actual impact, whether it's increased by 0.2 or 0.4. I haven't got time to go into those details, but I'd be happy to answer that later. And when it comes to economic impact, there was a moderate impact, and societal and well-being was good impact. So in the UK at the moment, as we all know, there are a number of policies that are not addressed in the workplace for women, and in particular, gender imbalance, as well as motherhood penalty, are dominating, basically affecting women's decision to have children. Financial policies such as one-time baby bonus or tax credit for families have had a moderate impact on fertility rate and a strong impact on well-being of individuals and society. When it comes to assisted reproduction policies, there were a number of things we looked at: introducing public funding for ART, increasing availability of ART, which means making ART affordable, even if it is not publicly funded, providing egg freezing subsidies, allowing more inclusive ART for same-sex couples and single women, and introducing programs to improve fertility, education, and awareness. All of these come under assisted reproduction policies, not just public funding for the ART. So if we look at the star rating, clearly public funding for ART, as well as making IVF affordable, had a much better impact than providing egg freezing subsidies. There isn't enough evidence at the moment as regards to number of papers published. That doesn't mean in the future it will not become relevant. And then others, as you can see. So if we look at the UK scene, we are not doing very well at all. In fact, we have a postcode lottery when it comes to IVF funding, and it's around only 7% of ICBs fund 3 cycles of IVF. In England, that's something like 3 ICBs out of 42 ICBs. When it comes to same-sex couples and single women, in fact, 52% of ICBs still expect, that is integrated care boards, still expect women to have IUI self-funded. So we really have to address this. And if we look at the studies about ART policies as population policies, these are the studies that are available. Fertility rate impact, a study published in 2006 by Grant et al. That investigated whether ART should be part of population policy. And that showed that if in the UK, if we increased access to ART from 625 cycles to 2,106 cycles per million women, then it would increase total fertility rate from 1.62 to 1.66. And the French studies have also shown, published in 2008, that you could increase total fertility rate by 0.4 if infertile people had to resort to ART, and by 0.2 points if half of those couples had access to ART. So there is evidence at the moment to by 0.4 or 0.4. Economic impact is the paper that was published by Ashley Capri Workshop Group, which was in 2015. The study is mainly by Connolly. That showed that the lifetime economic value of an infant born in the UK is about 800,000 euros. So anyone in the Treasury should jump at this and say it is a huge, huge return on investment. That's even if you spend £20,000 to give 3 or 4 cycles of IVF, the return on investment is huge. When it comes to societal and individual impact, clearly there is evidence to show that there is reduction in mental health drug prescriptions for women. There's reduction in multiple births. There's reduction in social stigma associated with infertility, and there's improved family well-being and social equity. So based on all the research and papers, key recommendations were made by the Economist Impact research for policies. First thing is prioritize long-term thinking, because it can take decades to have the real big impact. So, and therefore, I believe in something like this should have cross-departmental, cross-governmental, and probably cross-party thinking for the long term to provide or to invest in family support services, particularly childcare, parental leave, as well as flexible and part-time working arrangements for women, which are the largest barriers for parenthood, encourage research and collaboration between policymakers, as well as the stakeholders, and most importantly, to promote and prioritize not just gender parity, but equality policies, which seem to be central to achieving this. And equality in the workplace as well as at work, at home are crucial, because these initiatives can empower everyone, particularly women who need to balance their career aspirations to family life, therefore creating a better environment for them to raise children and decide on parenthood.
Our next speaker is Professor Bart Fauser. Bart is the scientific director of the International Federation of Fertility Societies, the IFFS, and he is Emeritus Professor of Reproductive Medicine at Utrecht University. He is the lead author of the IFFS consensus document on declining global fertility rates and contributor to the on declining global fertility rates and contributor to the campaign and a toolkit. And he's a contributor to the recent Economist Impact Report, which Geeta has just been talking about. So the Fertility Policy and Practice, a Toolkit for Europe. He is co-author of the book Baby Making, What the New Reproductive Treatments Mean for Families and Society, and co-editor of the book Polycystic Ovary Syndrome. And he's a contributor to the Handbook of Current and Novel Protocols for the Treatment of Infertility.
I've been following the pet activities for years, but this actually is the first. I've been writing in BioNews, but this is the first time participating in a webinar like this, which I accepted with great pleasure. You mentioned, Sarah, about sharing information and awareness, and that is also exactly the current focus of the International Federation of Fertility Societies, the IFFS, where I currently act as the scientific director. And human fertility and what's happening and all the distinct changes in human fertility has been a key focus of attention. So my disclosure, I think for the current topic, it's important to mention my involvement in IFFS, the organization I just mentioned. Despite much resistance entering this area of childbirth, more and more international and national bodies are focusing on this. This, I think, is a very interesting report of the OECD countries. They have wonderful statistics. This is all available via the internet. So if you are interested, you can just search. So it is not just a decreasing fertility, which is relevant in this context, but also children or women getting less children. They're getting children at a later age, which is depicted here. There are more and more children who remain without children, and this goes up to 30%, which is indeed very, very significant. There are many ideas and sometimes strong views. What underlays these changes in childbearing? But I think it is diverse. It may vary on different places on the planet. But the bottom line is, I think it's fair to state that we don't really know. We don't have properly designed big number public health studies to investigate what are the drivers for individuals to decide whether they want to have children or not. Of course, a very, very vital question in the world where we more and more see a very significant drop in childbirth, as Geeta has outlined for the UK, and certainly finance and housing is an important factors, particularly in Western European countries. I have been leading a consensus report published in Human Reproduction Update early last year, with many of people involved who have really contributed to the science, spread out from all over the world, from South America to Australia to the Middle East, Europe, the US, and the focus. It's a narrative, a summary, and we even getting this paper published, we could clearly see the resistance to really talk about this topic. And it took me quite a while to understand why that is. And I came to the conclusion that it still relates to and goes back to the Rome report focusing on the need to decrease birth rates. So there has been so much focus on decreasing birth rates and decreasing population growth that this didn't really fit. So in this paper, we highlight that having a family is a human right, that countries need to adopt family-friendly policies, and I will go in a little more detail here, and we have to make fertility care more accessible. It's not just a decrease in population, it is also the percentage of countries below replacement level. This is now already over 50%, but before the end of this century, it will be more than 90%. And there is a huge discrepancy in access to fertility care. Again, more and more bodies start to realize the impact of a decreasing population in Asia and in this case in Europe. This is, I think, a very interesting report from the European Commission, again, easily accessible via the internet. Demographic challenges in Europe, October 2023. So profound demographic changes, decline, aging, negative impact on competitiveness, labor shortage, the green and digital transition. So it impacts on all aspects of life and society as a whole. And they designed a toolbox focusing on what can you do related to parents, related to the youngsters, elderly, and migration. You've heard about the toolbox and about the details. I will not dwell on this. My comment that I would like to make is that I think in this particular document, again, which you can easily access via internet, you can see a summary of all the studies undertaken in various countries related to changes in policy and what would it mean, mainly focus on fertility rates. I think it's for the first time. You can also see this. These are usually not so very well designed studies, a short time of follow-up. So there is a lot of room for improvement here, but at least based on the evidence that we have in the literature, this is built, this complex system, and you can easily, by this, the aim is as a toolbox to be very practical and say, if you switch one button, if it's either a workplace policy or a childcare policy, what are the implications of this? Because, and you will see it a little later, many European bodies already take child-friendly policies. This seems fairly haphazard, and there's no real thinking behind this, let alone that there's international collaboration here. This I found a very interesting overview. Focus on child-friendly policies. You can see, number one, in terms of money, because it's almost all money, that there's a huge discrepancy comparing one country to the other, as you can see, and also how it's done, as payments, services, tax breaks. So this information already is there. So although, and I've heard this a lot, at least in the Dutch discussion in news media, politicians say, oh, we don't want to enter on discussion about children because this should remain in the private domain. But what apparently they don't realize, they're already under this discussion by trying to facilitate having children or trying to decrease barriers to children, mainly focus on money. So then what does ART bring to decreasing population growth? This is a very recent overview of global data. ICMAR, David Adamson, published this month in Fertility Study, and here you see the number of children born growing logarithmically. This is up to 2017. So for now, there will be between 15 and 20 million children born following ART worldwide. And here on the right-hand side, you can see that this growth, not surprisingly, is mainly in Asia, where until recently in some major countries, there was a one-child policy. They released that, and now they try to facilitate as much having children. And part of it is that they make IVF free. So, what are the implications of this uptake of ART, and where it's well registered, and it may be highest in Denmark until fairly recently? 9% of children are born following ART. So, which is, I think, very, very significant. No, no, in other words, in many classes of, this is 9%, sorry. So in many high school classes, at least one child is an IVF child. And here you see the huge discrepancy within Europe, but even worldwide. So here it's 10 per 100, here it's way less than 1 per 100 children. So there's a huge global discrepancy in the availability, access to ART care. Then what we witnessed in Western societies, this is of course debated now in the current discussion, particularly in the US, you see more and more fertility care interventions being applied under conditions not necessarily related to infertility per se, so-called modern families. Susan Gollenbach has worked on this very extensively. So this is mainly for single individuals, gay couples, lesbian couples, surrogacy, and there's no data how often this is applied compared to total ART. But this has become very, very significant. So the question of this discussion this evening is: can ART make up for the decrease in population in children being born? And there's only one study that addresses this directly. It's a modeling study performed by Henri Léridon, a demographer from France, published 20 years ago. And this relates to what are natural chances for conception if you start having children at age 30, 35, 40, and we know this decreases dramatically. And then it calculates, based on this modeling, if all these women would have early access to IVF, how would that compensate for loss? And it says in this particular model that it's 50% compensates, and at older age, less than 30%. So to address the question for the symposium, the answer is no. ART cannot make up for the decrease in natural fertility with postponing the wish to have children. Of course, there's a lot to be said about this. It is the only study directly addressing this question. So there is a very active patient organization, Fertility Europe, and they looked in Europe related to access to care, whether it's funded or not, legislation, patient perspective, and you see here the ranking. Dark green is the highest, red is the lowest. Now here you see for England, here the Netherlands, but you see more in Eastern Europe. It's still far from ideal. So there is a lot to be done here to improve access to care, particularly in more Eastern European countries. And for sure, Fertility Europe will follow up what is happening and is in direct contact with the EU to discuss this further. So, what are possible steps to do this? There is much, and most of it is creating awareness that for the desire to have children, and that many people have less children than they would like to have, that family building next to family planning should become an important strategy. What are society implications of underpopulation? Indeed, infertility has to be taken more seriously by government bodies, by funding bodies, by hospitals. Public funding for fertility, it is rapidly increasing in many European countries. We should also, of course, focus on access to care, making it cheaper and less risky. And this is my last slide. Certainly focus on on awareness. The IFFS has started a more joint campaign, focus on healthcare providers, companies. What can companies do to decrease barriers for couples to have children for their employees and policymakers? And we are working hard via all local companies to be as effective as possible to discuss this matter, provide relevant information, and increase awareness.
So we're going to move on now to the next speaker, Dr. Chris Skedgel. Chris is the director of the Office of Health Economics. He's an honorary research fellow at the University of East Anglia's Health Economics Group, and he's lead author of research and commentary in publications such as BMJ Open, The Patient, and Pharmacoeconomics Open, where he's published on how the public values fertility treatment.
So I've been asked to speak about, like the other speakers, the role of fertility treatment in what I'm calling the current demographic contraction. I'm avoiding more dramatic words like collapse and crisis, but we can come to that later. In pictures, what the previous speakers have already told us, the world is experiencing a demographic contraction. Even sub-Saharan Africa, which has a relatively high fertility rate at the moment, is projected to fall below a replacement level by the end of the century. This has important implications, important economic implications for how we fund our public services. This includes healthcare and most obviously pensions. Currently, younger, healthier people tend to younger, healthier, and typically more productive younger people pay towards the care and the pensions of older people who are retired, more likely to use healthcare services. So we can see this as a generational transfer. The number of workers today fund healthcare and pensions for people who are retired and were working in the past, who in turn were funding older people when they were in their working age. So we can see that in Europe, that dependency ratio is set to climb quite high by the end of the century. It's even more dramatic in China, where there is expected to be 120 people for every 100 workers. There are expected to be 120 people in some sort of dependency state, either young people young people going to publicly funded schools, or older people on publicly funded pensions or publicly funded healthcare. So this is the primary economic implication of what we're seeing in this demographic contraction. As the number of younger people who are moving into the workforce declines, the burden on those ones that do remain in the workforce increases. So if we're going to think about the role of fertility treatment in addressing this contraction, let's explore what's driving this contraction. So I think you've heard from both the previous speakers now, there's a pattern of fewer children later. So this holds in the US, which currently is actually at the better end of the scale in terms of fertility rates, and across the OECD, an organization of roughly 40 high to middle income countries. We're seeing the same pattern, fewer, smaller families and beginning family formation later. So in some senses, that's the bad news. And then maybe if I can move to a slightly more positive note, what seems to be driving this decline? So we see a very strong association between women's educational achievement and the fertility rate. As women become more educated, they have fewer children. I can't comment on what's driving this pattern. Is it more freedom, more opportunities, simply better quality of life, and they feel they don't want to have as many children? But we do see this pattern. So we see this pattern between a fairly positive outcome in terms of women's achievement and lower birth rates. The same holds when we expand it beyond women and just look at the Human Development Index. Countries that have higher Human Development Index, typically a higher quality of life, higher standard of living, higher standard of happiness, all are associated with lower rates of childbirth. So in some sense, this lower fertility rate is the product of good things. It doesn't mean that trying to increase the fertility rate means we have to turn back the clock in terms of human development. But when we look at it, when we look more perhaps on the sunny side, we can say that this is the product of some fairly positive changes in the world. Even within the US, which I said is currently hasn't experienced quite the drop in fertility rates that some other countries have, we see a fairly dramatic increase in intended childlessness. So obviously the first step in understanding the role of fertility treatment is understanding how many people want children in the first place. And to some extent, what we're seeing here is a suggestion that there is a growing sense that there is a desire for no children at all, which obviously fertility treatment in itself will not address. But we can perhaps talk about what's driving both lower fertility rates and even a preference for childlessness. So we see, connected perhaps to the idea of Human Development Index, we see reduced child mortality, reduced child labor in society. These things are combining to change expectations around parenting and shifting parenthood goals from quantity to quality. One of the stories I saw recently was about the rise of private tutoring to get your child into daycare in Korea. Parents, the education system in Korea has become so competitive that parents are tutoring their children prior to daycare. So you can imagine why that would, you can see how that's shifting goals from quantity to quality. Better contraception options around the world have reduced the number of unintended pregnancies, which will have some effect on the fertility rate. The cost of living crisis that everyone's aware of, especially around cost of living, the cost of raising children in terms of education and housing tends to disincentivize larger families. There is greater societal acceptance of not having children. The idea of not having children isn't so much of a stigma anymore. And again, going back to the idea of the women's educational achievement, we see changing gender roles, more female participation in the workforce. All of this is associated with later family formation. And then finally, we get to that idea that later family formation is associated with a risk of greater infertility, a greater risk of infertility. So WHO says that currently 1 in 6 prospective parents have experienced infertility at some point. These are the people that we could potentially influence with better access to fertility treatment, better fertility treatment policies. As Sarah mentioned, one of my previous papers is about the idea of whether society is willing to fund a national fertility treatment, and the paper does find that there is a willingness to contribute to that for the good of society. But as Professor Nargund and I think Professor Fauser both mentioned, this is a relatively small, fertility as an overall driver appears to be a relatively small driver of the current gap between where we are in terms of fertility and of replacement level fertility. Quick back to the envelope calculation suggests maybe that's about 10% of the gap, which obviously leaves 90% of the gap to be addressed by these other factors that I think have come up in this Economist Impact Report. So if I can draw any conclusion from all of this without wanting to sound too certain, but my impression would be that fertility treatments in themselves are unlikely to compensate for these trends towards smaller family sizes and overcome some of the broader economic challenges that may be disincentivizing fertility. There are some examples of countries that have had specific policies around fertility, often baby bonuses, different forms of childcare support. So France, Hungary, and the Nordics, which we can imagine have approached this problem in different ways, but all of them have approached it in terms of trying to spend more and encourage greater fertility. So despite the fact that they've spent more than the OECD average on these sorts of policies, we don't see any difference in their average fertility compared to to the other countries that may be spending less. So I don't think we can buy our way out of this problem. There is a greater societal question about how this needs to be addressed. So in this last paragraph, so OECD itself suggests we need to prepare for a low fertility future. This includes considering how immigration, bringing underrepresented groups into the workforce, and improving productivity could help to address some of the economic challenges that I mentioned at the beginning. So this has all been a little bit depressing, so I will try and end this on a positive note. The speaker at the OHE annual lecture this year, Professor Andrew Scott, made the point that we shouldn't be framing the current demographic transition as a crisis, because it overlooks the fact that a lot of this demographic transition is being driven by quite dramatic gains in healthy life expectancy around the world. He's suggesting rather than trying to change the population to fit our institutions and how we've chosen up till now to fund our public services, maybe we need to look at it the other way and adapt our institutions to fit our populations. So in the end, he suggests let's celebrate these gains and reshape our institutions.
So we now come to our final speaker this evening, who is Paul Morland. Paul is a demographer, an author, and a broadcaster. He is the author of books including No One Left, Why the World Needs More Children, Tomorrow's People, The Future of Humanity in 10 Numbers, and The Human Tide, How Population Shaped the Modern World. Paul was previously an Associate Research Fellow at Birkbeck, University of London, and a Senior Member of at St Anthony's College.
First of all, I'm delighted to be in such august company, and also delighted that people are now taking this problem very, very seriously, that there is a consensus that it is a very serious issue. And I think all three of the previous speakers have acknowledged that. And I admire the efforts of people, as quoted by Chris Skedgel, who are trying to fit our institutions around our demography rather than vice versa. But I do think that things like the welfare state and care for the elderly might have to go by the board if we're just going to accept the decline of the population and its endless aging. So talk of institutions is very nice, but when it comes to brass tacks, I think this is a very serious problem, which will have very serious and negative consequences if we don't address it. Now, in my book, No One Left, Why the World Needs More Children, I spent quite a lot of time trying to tease out what are the causes of our low and falling fertility rate, not just in Europe, but in East Asia and North America. Increasingly in parts of the world you would not associate with low fertility. Who knew that Jamaica has a lower fertility rate than the UK? Thailand has a similarly low fertility rate. So really quite poor countries are moving in this direction. And I spent very little time talking about biology. So you can think about, I think people get confused with the term fertility, and they think there's biological fertility, which is the ability of people to actually have children. And then there's the total fertility rate, which has been very well explained as people's actual tendency to have children. So you have to say, if people are not having enough children, what is the fundamental cause of that? Is it biological, or is it demographic, if you like, cultural and economic? And the best data that I've seen suggests that at a given age, people have as much chance of conceiving now as they ever did. Of course, people are trying to have their children later, so there are more biological fertility problems than there were in the past. But that's not yet a product of the much reported, much discussed falling sperm count, for example, but rather just that people are having their children later. And I was discussing this on a podcast about it was a Spectator TV, and I was on with the writer Lionel Shriver, who for a novelist takes a great deal of interest in these matters. And the question came up from the viewers: what about the biological issues? We were talking about the economic issues, the cultural issues, And I said then that it was rather like, if we're worrying about sperm counts, it's rather like someone on a ship that's been hit already and is already sinking, looking out and saying, oh, look, there's an iceberg out there. This may be a problem for the future. But actually, biological problems in having children continue to be relatively modest. And therefore, as the previous speakers have said, fixing them through IVF will be only a very small part, an important part, and a laudable part, but only a relatively small part of any potential solution. So what actually is going on? Why are people having fewer and fewer children if it's not the biology? It's a whole range of things. In fact, I put together a paper for a pronatalism conference happening this weekend in Austin, Texas. I'm not attending it, but I worked with a friend of mine who you may know, some of you who take an interest in these things, from X, from Twitter, Daniel Hess, who goes by the handle More Births. We put together a list of a dozen or more factors that seem to be driving fertility down. None of them are absolutely universal. There are exceptions everywhere. And these include things like the increasing dissociation of men and women, the problems people have in building relationships, the fact that many cities are being built in extremely unfamily friendly ways, the lack of family friendly accommodation and housing, and factors that I think are often overlooked, such as the propaganda of antinatalism, which has profoundly entered our schools and our universities, so that a huge amount of time is spent persuading children that they shouldn't have children of their own. Very little time, a lot of time is spent teaching them how not to get pregnant, which again I completely think is laudable. The end of unintended pregnancies in teenage 8 years is a good thing, but very, very little time is spent explaining to them that if they leave and put off forever having children, the curve of fertility will decline, and that they will have less and less chance of having children, and that they will come to rely on technologies which are far from reliable. So I think there are a whole complex range of social and economic conditions that are causing low fertility. No one's got a complete handle on it. It seems to vary from place to place. For sure, there is a role for government in addressing these issues. In my book, No One Left, Why the World Needs More Children, my penultimate chapter was what government can do for us. And my last chapter was what we can do for ourselves. So I do believe we need to build, all of us needs to work towards building a pronatal culture. If government is pushing against a closed door, if government is trying to introduce pronatal policies in a culture that is profoundly antinatal, then it will find it very, very difficult. So I think there is a social and a civic responsibility, a responsibility of all of us, including us as parents and grandparents, to do what we can to encourage people to have more children. And we can't entirely rely on the government to do it. But I think government activity is extremely important. I think government signalling is really important. So it's very disappointing that we now have, for the first time ever in the UK, a leading politician who has spoken on the subject, Keir Starmer, only to say none of my business and I'm not going to do anything about it. So to return to the specific issue of IVF, if people are going to put off having their children, then they are more likely to require that kind of assistance. I think it is absolutely laudable that governments do provide help, that technology gets better and better. So it's a question of research. It's a question of making it available. It's very notable that the one country in the OECD which has got a healthy fertility rate, Israel, which has 3 children per woman. It's not a poor country. It's a highly advanced country, high levels of female education, high levels of dense urbanization, all the correlates you'd expect would just be associated with low fertility, and they have a reasonably high fertility. They don't actually have very many pronatal policies, but there is a consistently pronatal rhetoric on the part of the politicians going all the way back to the foundation of the country, and there is also an exceptionally generous policy on IVF. So essentially, couples can have just about as much IVF as they want. There is a danger that if we have the technology too prominently spoken about, too generously provided, that people will think they can just leave it to the technology, that they can leave their childbearing later and later, that it'll sort itself out. So I think people need to be realistic at any point about what artificial forms of conception and childbearing can deliver. But I think they are important not only to fill that gap. We've got to be realistic. It's only a small part of the child gap, the birth gap, that can be filled by this, because still most people can, thank goodness, have their children naturally if that's what they choose to do at an appropriate time. But it is important for filling part of that gap. And also, the reason I think it's very important that the state supports it is that it's part of the state sending a signal out to the rest of society that having children is important, that creating the next generation is not just going to mean that we have an economy, we have a welfare state, but that we actually have a human race going forward, and that future generations will be there to carry on the baton of human civilization, human flourishing, that we are all the product of, and grateful for the former generations that have gone before us, that have created the world that we've been privileged to live in, and that we have a responsibility for passing on to future generations and creating those future generations.
I wanted to give the panelists an opportunity if they wanted to actually ask a question of one another, or raise something that they think, well, I was kind of hoping you'd raise that because I didn't have time in my 10 minutes. So if any of you got anything that you'd like to flag now, Geeta.
No, I just wondered, because we didn't really discuss immigration as part of this, which is an important part when it comes to population. So I just wondered if any of the panelists wanted to comment if immigration is a solution.
Who wants to go first on that? Chris, you're on mute at the minute.
I'm the one that mentioned institutions, so maybe that means I will take the first stab at this one. I'm not going to take a firm position on that, but my view would be that would be one of the institutions that we would need to consider revisiting, without saying yes, we must do one thing or the other around that. But that feels like the natural one to begin speaking about.
Bart,
I have a question for Paul, if I may. You mentioned that you outlined with a friend in the US the possible reasons for people to decide whether they want to have children, yes or no. So, on the other hand, I stated that despite there are many strong views on this, there's actually very little data. Do you agree that it's poorly studied? Number one, and my second question would be, do you envision that the reasons for not having children or having fewer children will be different in different parts of the world?
I do agree it's not been very well documented, and we've tried what I really have tried to do with for anyone who's interested, go to More Births on X, and Daniel Hess has consistently tried to pull together all the data there is, whether it's looking at religiosity and its correlation globally to fertility, whether it's looking at house prices as opposed to the sorts of houses that are built. He's pulled together, I think, probably the best data you can do. And we've put it into one document. Now, I think what's really interesting is that this is an extremely global phenomenon. We know, as I said, from Jamaica to Thailand, from Canada to Australia, increasingly countries which we've considered traditionally less developed and poorer are seeing this low fertility. And certainly there's no one factor. And the interesting thing is, almost whatever you come up with, you will find a counterexample. So I've already said, if you say it's dense population, high levels of female education, then you'll find that Israel is sort of bucking the trend. If you look at the UK and you say it's about housing costs, and people tell you, well, if only young families could get started, housing so expensive. But then you actually look across the country, the correlation between housing costs and fertility just isn't there. So I think we can the strange thing, the mysterious things are almost philosophically about this question, is that it seems to be universal, and yet any single cause you identify, you seem to be able to find an exception.
Sure. And the document you mentioned, the summary, is that publicly available? Is that in the public domain?
It's not yet. It's going to be distributed at this conference. But anyone who wants to email me, you can find my email address by Googling me. You'll find my website. On my website, there are contact details. And if anyone would like a PDF copy, I will see what I can do.
I'm going to go with Chelsea Lim first. She says, thanks, Chris, for sharing your conclusions, views about accepting a low fertility future. I'm just wondering about the potential social and economic consequences of over-relying on policies like higher immigration rates to compensate for low fertility rates. In your view, and she says the other speakers can chip in, would it be more beneficial in the long run for societies to maintain their populations organically through encouraging higher birth rates, etc.? So,
I think the current debates we see going around immigration, to some extent, we can say Brexit was partly driven by immigration and fears of immigration. I think, yeah, the easy answer is sure. The most acceptable solution to society is probably yes. Let's replace people in a country with the people who are already living in that country. At the same time, I'm an economist. I'm concerned with choices and preferences and the implications of forcing a population to replace itself. Make me a little bit uncomfortable. So yes, the first best solution is finding some way to encourage without forcing people to have children. Failing that, probably increasing immigration is the second best solution. But even in the slide I started with, the currently high fertility regions of the world are trending towards below replacement themselves. So to some extent, even if we accepted greater immigration around the world, that's still probably only a temporary fix for the issue.
anybody else want to come on in this one? Paul? And then
I didn't have a
Geeta.
chance to talk about immigration, so I have written a lot about what I call the trilemma, the trade-off, that you can have 2 out of 3 things. You can have low fertility rate, you can have ethnic continuity and no mass immigration changing your ethnic balance. You can have economic dynamism. You can't have all 3. So Japan, for example, doesn't want immigration, doesn't want to have children, and so it fades away economically. Britain does want its economy to be reasonably dynamic. Whether it's succeeding is another question, but it doesn't want the children, so it has mass immigration and ethnic change. The one point I would make, though, is, well, 2 points. First of all, that countries we've traditionally had our immigration from have themselves very low fertility rates and rising economies. So Britain, Ireland, for example, and Poland have far fewer 20-somethings than they had 20 years ago, and the living standard gap just isn't there anymore. So we're having to bring in immigrants from countries further and further away. There are fewer and fewer countries that have got very high fertility rates, and they are increasingly countries with very low levels of human development. So the economic, just from an economic point of view, the contribution is going to be lower, the cultural differences are going to be greater, the political backlash is going to be stronger. So I think that really limits what can be done. And also, of course, the immigrants get old, their fertility rates conform to the local societies, and so it becomes a Ponzi scheme. We can't all be solving the problem by moving the pieces on the chessboard around when there are no more pieces on the chessboard. And finally, very briefly, the debilitating effect to countries where their best and brightest are leaving is incredible. And people are actually working, I know, who are working in business and finance in many developing countries feel very acutely the way that those economies are failing to develop because the best and brightest are being skimmed off into the developed world. So I think many of us have relied on immigration, and we've been jolly lucky to have Polish plumbers, to have Filipinos working in the old age homes and so on. But we actually got to realize that this is not a long-term solution for our societies, and it's a form ultimately of a kind of biological imperialism.
Now, Geeta.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Chris about encouraging people to have children first and then use immigration to help with that. So far, the evidence seems to be migration in the long run is really not going to help. It can be a population stabilizer and particularly help with the age structure of the population. But they can have a higher fertility rate initially, but then it declines over time. And also, as Paul mentioned, there are other issues, and political cycles have an influence on immigrants and immigration policies. We really need long-term, open immigration policies. And the IMF produced some evidence some years ago showing that in countries with aging population, older people are more resistant to immigrants. So it's more difficult to work in countries where they're needed to work on open immigration policies. So it's quite complex, but it's not a long-term solution at all.
And Bart.
Yeah. Let me first state that I think that this is a very potential contagious discussion in my country, in the Netherlands, in the main Europe countries. Now, of course, we have more and more political changes and anti-immigration. And one of our prominent politicians, he was just crucified by stating the very obvious. And you say, if you have parts of the world where there is too few children, and there's and employers they are crying for more people, more labor force, and there are other parts on the planet where there are way too many young people with no future. Guess what's going to happen? These people are going to travel, whether we like it or not, whether it's policy or not. And I think that is what has been shown. So we also have to be realistic. And I agree with all the previous speakers. But on the other hand, it is a reality.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to move on because we're gaining more and more questions, unlike babies. So this is an anonymous attendee who says, it seems that even when finance is addressed, women still choose not to have families. How can we make being a mother more desirable for more people?
Yeah.
Bart
Could
first.
I just one general comment? I've been traveling quite a lot in Eastern European countries in recent years, and in many of the countries, governments start to fully reimburse IVF. Really, many of the countries, and within 2 or 3 years, the number of ART cycles tripled. So we don't know yet exactly what that means, but of course there will be more children being born following ART. It's not going to solve the problem, but it's not useless. And there has been some studies. I remember one in Canada where in one state they started public funding for IVF, and then they followed how many more children were born. So it is measurable and it's there, but that too may be just part of the bigger picture. And for sure, many people who decide not to have children, whether IVF is funded or not, it doesn't make any difference.
Geeta, did you want to come in on this one?
I don't think I have anything to add to what Bart just said on this one, but overall, we do know that despite the barriers and changing societal norms and cultural shifts, the evidence shows that more people would like to have a child, and more people would like to have more children than they currently have. But as I said, it's quite a complex picture. We can't just say giving IVF for childcare will make women have children. I mean, we know that isn't the case.
Okay, I shall move on unless, yep. So, a question for Chris. Chris, your slides show a small lift in total fertility rate from 2002 to 2008. Do you know what changed? The trend is still down.
I can give you some speculation off the top of my head, but the honest
Yep.
answer will be no, I don't know what
Okay.
will have changed in those years.
We're not opposed to speculation. We can live with that.
I mean, to the extent that those were the years that followed the economic crisis, the financial crisis, maybe more unemployed people had more time to spend at home together, and we had a mini baby boom.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay. Another question. Shouldn't we be relying on easing early parenthood, not medically treating the consequences of delay. I can see Bart nodding. And
So
Geeta's
that's the
probably.
idea about having the right information, awareness. We should start much younger, probably at high school, to focus on these areas that people know way in advance what reproduction means, male, female, what postponing means. So yes, ART or any form of infertility should not be a panacea for being uninformed at a younger age.
And yes, before I just go to Paul, I was going to say I dialed in today to 1.5 hour meeting in the European Parliament about fertility education and the resources that are being produced to help with that, and the other, different professional bodies around the world, and IFFS, and I know Geeta's done a lot on fertility education too over the years. And it is still quite shocking, the gaps in knowledge that actually came out in the meeting that I was in of young people, when you think, gosh, they really still not know some of these things? And yeah, they don't is the answer. Sorry, Paul.
Well, I think I completely agree with the thrust of the question. I think people, however, are going to be free to make their own decisions, just as we want to have a higher fertility rate without in any way going back on the gains that women have made. So, as I always say, we have to kind of create a pronatal feminism. We're not going back to the 1950s. So, we have to accept that these technologies exist and that people will want to use them. But I think the key is educating people so that they actually know that if they have their children at a certain time, they'll stand or if they try, they'll have a much better chance of success. They should understand both the extent to which fertility tails off in your 30s and also the likelihood, the expense, the inconvenience, the unpleasantness of IVF as an alternative. So I think education is really critical, and it is noteworthy that there was a head of one Cambridge college that wanted to educate the youngsters in the college on this matter, and she was pretty much stopped from doing so. So I agree, it needs to be at school, it needs to be at university. We need people to understand the facts, to be more educated, and then they will make the choices accordingly.
Absolutely, it's all about reproductive choice, and ignorance doesn't really help with that, does it? So I'll move on now to the next question from someone, Cherise, I think. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it. And they say, I'm guessing people here also know that the issue of fertility rate decline is also taken on by transhumanist, far right, and white supremacist groups, such as the pronatalist movement in the US. They paint a doomy picture of the situation and argue for a classic eugenic control of reproduction, e.g., promoting the reproduction of the clever at the expense of what they call the dumb ones. People with these views are now in position of power. Elon Musk, or very active and well organized, the US, the pronatalist movement, and then there's some links which I shan't read out. And then we get to the question, which is, how can you or we make sure that all this research, lobbying, and policy making is not playing into the hands of these far right movements? Maybe in a similar way that human genomic studies on intelligence or race differences played into the hand of white supremacists. So I don't know who wants to have a go at that one first. I was thinking perhaps Paul, giving the sort of conference that he was talking about.
I'm very happy to talk about it. So I think there are a number of things. First of all, I'm so pleased that we are talking about it, because if we don't talk about it, we leave it in the hands of the extremists. So I think people like us talking about it, attending conferences, is really important. That's one thing. Secondly, it's really important that we make people realize this is a global phenomenon, not a national phenomenon. This is not a white European phenomenon. This is a Chinese phenomenon, a Japanese phenomenon. Almost everywhere in Latin America, it's an issue. In the Caribbean, it's extremely bad. In the British survey, the one minority ethnic group that actually declined in the last survey were the Afro-Caribbeans. I mean, African population is growing from immigration, but the Afro-Caribbeans as a community in this country have got one of the lowest fertility rates. So I think, number one, we the people of the politically sensible people need to talk about it and not leave it just to the extremists. Number two, we need to point out just how much it's a human question and not a question of one particular ethnic group or another. And I think the third thing is to point out, when I've often said this, when I'm accused of, oh, you must be far right, blah, 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 I say, have you ever read Marx on Malthus, one of the most eloquent, and I mean, certainly not a Marxist, believe me, one of the most clever and sophisticated arguments against antinatalism that was ever written. Did you know that the Soviet Union, all the socialist countries, Cuba, China under Mao, I mean, lots of people who are now excoriated, of course, by the left, but the old heroes of the left were all extremely pronatalist, because they realized if you want to create a capitalist society or a socialist society or any other kind of society, you need people to be able to do it. So it's only very recently that this has become an issue associated purely and exclusively with the right. And it's the responsibility of all of us to point out this is a human issue. It's not a left-right or a black-white issue.
Great. I think I'm looking at the other panelists, but I think Paul answered that so well. They're all content for me to move on. So I'm going to move on. We've had a couple, because we're doing another event on this very topic. Some of the speakers for that future event have dialed in, and they've got questions. So I'm going to go to them next. So we have Soren Zieber, who's got a question for you, Bart. He says, Bart, you just showed the exponential rise in the use of assisted reproduction. This doesn't seem to fit with the decreasing desire to have children. That's a tricky question.
Hi, Soren. Thanks for the question. I think they're not in contrast with each other, because, the decreasing number of children being born is related predominantly to people who can have children but don't want to, or wait too long. I think the increasing number of children born following IVF relates to the technology being improved and access to care. More and more countries have IVF readily available, and last but not least, there is more and more countries that reimburse, so there are no longer financial barriers. So all those factors, but as you well know, IVF is still, as a medical intervention, grossly underused. If worldwide everybody who would qualify medically for undergoing ART, if you compare that number with the actual number of IVF, of course, there is still a huge potential for increased usage.
Great. And then the next question from the speaker from the event that we're going to be holding on the 9th of April is from Roger Gosden. And Roger says, thanks to all the speakers for clarity of presentations and data, and showing IVF can only make a small contribution to the problem. Question for you, Bart. Commercialization of IVF and the dominance of ICSI that he's in scare quotes solved male infertility have discouraged investment in fertility research. Don't expect the USA to develop breakthrough technologies needed for affordable treatment. Where does the EU investment now stand in this area in research?
Hi, Roger. Thanks for the question, and it makes a lot of sense. I have to temper your expectations. I think at the EU level, infertility in general is not much higher on the priority list compared to the US. So that's still a struggle for everybody working in infertility. That public funded money nationally or internationally, fertility is very, very low on the priority list. And even in infertility care per se, I'm actually looking at it right now. As you very well know, IVF, the whole IVF scene has changed dramatically, and now IVF worldwide is practiced usually in commercial in a commercial setting with private equity. There's much research going on, but the research performed is usually very technology focused and trying to improve outcomes, rather than looking at the bigger picture in terms of do we practice over treatment? Are there alternative, more causally oriented interventions, those are areas that receive very, very little interest, and there's actually very little studies going on because of a lack of funding.
And yes, we're always complaining in the UK about lack of funding for research in this area.
Yeah,
Geeta,
it's believe me, it's not just the UK.
Geeta, did you want to come in? You're on mute.
Thank you, Roger. Good to know you're here. So really, yeah, I agree with Bart. And in particular, it's not just about lack of public funding for research, but there really seems to be very little interest in research and trials leading to affordable IVF and reducing the burden of treatment. It is a huge struggle, and we at the Walking Egg Foundation from Belgium, we are making progress, but there's really no money at all. And in some ways, it has been a huge struggle to take it forward, apart from taking it as PhD work or some sort of trials. So I think there needs to be a movement, don't you think, Bart, to try and move this forward? Otherwise, I think it will be just high tech, more cost, expensive IVF, more treatment burden for those who are having treatment.
Yeah, making IVF more available in less resourced countries. You know, the whole tendency is more tech and more expensive and more interventions. And of course, those countries don't benefit from that at all. There, you want to do less invasive, simpler, cheaper. And indeed, there is very, very little attention for this.
Great. Okay. I'm going to go to a question from Lucia Brookamp. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name. She said, Bart was somewhat pessimistic about the potential of IVF to compensate for falling and delayed fertility, partly because the success rates aren't high enough, as the Leridan model shows. What do you think about increased use of egg freezing and egg donation to mitigate this? These show much higher success rates at older ages, so might be more promising. Currently, these are obviously hard to access, so maybe we should focus more on funding egg freezing at younger ages and making egg donation more accessible. I think that's a bit slightly controversial, but go on.
That's a great question, and indeed very, very controversial. If I would be a politician, which luckily I'm not, but if I would be, and if I would be able to allocate money in this area, I would better spend the money. I think the money would be better spent in developing education programs and awareness of that people know that postponing the wish for children may result in not having children if you wish to do so, rather than supporting more technologies. But let alone, or let that aside, yes, of course, all the fertility doctors working in the area now, they know that many of our patients, we see that the woman has waited too long and ovarian aging took place, and their chances for pregnancy, either without intervention or IVF, will be very low. And then you have to go for oocyte donation. If those women would have frozen their oocytes 10 years earlier, that problem would be solved. But also we know, and now that's well established in various countries, that women that freeze their eggs at a young age to be able to postpone and having children later on, the great majority of those women, they never return. So they're not using their eggs. So you see, it is not a simple solution.
Geeta, if you were a politician, what would you do? Would you be
Certainly,
funding egg freezing?
I don't think there's enough evidence at the moment that egg freezing, or public funding for egg freezing, would increase fertility rates. But I would certainly invest in education, agree with Bart. And in the UK, I mean, we absolutely need that education in secondary school because there are lots of gaps in the current education curriculum. And also, I would fund more IVF. I would get rid of this postcode lottery, fund more IVF, and have equal and fair funding across the country as women and couples deserve, and invest in helping single women and same-sex couples, because while we're addressing this topic, we really need to address the need for this LGBTQ plus community to create children. And in any progressive nation, if we want to have this community to have equal rights, then they need to have equal reproductive rights as well, and therefore they need that help. So I'll be doing that as well.
Great. And Paul, I think you fancied throwing your hat in the ring for this one, did you?
I only wanted to say that the same applies here as to IVF, that we do need to be careful we don't lull people into a false sense of security. I've had my eggs frozen, or IVF technology is becoming better, or whatever. Therefore, I can relax, forget about it, and then maybe I'll come back at 45 and think about it. I mean, that's one thing that you might put people off the better and more natural version. The other thing is, there are real advantages in having your children younger. I mean, I was mentioning to the panel earlier that I actually have 3 grandchildren staying with me at the moment. And I didn't have my children at a particularly early age, but I had my 3 children around the age of 30, and now I've got my 4th grandchild on the way, the age of 60, and one can be so much more participative. And that's not only just a nice thing to have, but if you're a participative grandparent, because you haven't had your children too late, it means, well, first of all, when you're a parent, you're not also worrying about looking after the older parents of yourself. That's something I'm now doing, but as a grandparent, not someone with primary care and responsibility. But by being a more participative grandparent, you can also encourage your children to have more children themselves, because you help ease the burden. So just leaving it is not only a risky strategy, but I'm all in favor of giving people these technologies, but giving them all the information they can make an informed choice. And a better choice is to have your children earlier and to do it naturally if you possibly.
Great. Thank you for that. I'm going to go now to Rachel Bowlby. Rachel has a question for Chris. She says, Chris, thanks for the hearteningly positive account of all the good reasons why birth rates have fallen. Any specific suggestions for changing the shape of institutions to go with the changed demographics, different work patterns, for instance, including more shared participation in care of the elderly or otherwise dependent?
I think I'm getting all the politically sensitive questions today. In terms of institutions, and confessing that this isn't something I've necessarily spent loads of time thinking about, but the natural things to begin thinking about. Currently, most societies tax income. One way to shift the institutions is to begin taxing wealth rather than income. So to the extent that wealth tends to accumulate over time, older people have more wealth than income. An inheritance tax would be one form of taxing wealth rather than income. And my wife is from Switzerland, and I'm aware that they tax the value of your house at some certain rate every year rather than focusing so much on your labor income. So that would be potentially one way of transforming our institutions to fund the welfare state. A second one, again, straying into Marxist ideology again, is shifting some of that tax burden from individuals to corporations and businesses. That makes it less dependent on the number of individuals that are being taxed, and rather shifting it from income taxes again to more business taxes. But again, that has implications for relative competitiveness of different countries and exactly what we see now, kind of a race to the bottom in terms of corporate tax rates.
Does anybody else want to come in on that one? No. Okay. So an anonymous person has said, for a long time, there were people who said overpopulation would be a huge problem. They turned out to be wrong. Now there are people who say that underpopulation will be a huge problem. How do we know they're not equally wrong? So I'm going to go to Paul first on that one.
Well, first of all, I talk on this subject a lot, and I do get various responses along the lines of, oh, first you were telling us we were too many people, now you're telling us too few, therefore it's all a lot of nonsense. And I think that's a bit like, nobody ever says to an economist, oh, 30 years ago you were telling us inflation was too high, and now you're telling us it's under control. I mean, when the facts change, you change your opinion. it's reasonable to say in the 1960s, before we really understood what was happening, that we had very high fertility rates throughout the world. Even in developed countries, we had plummeting infant mortality rates, which was wonderful news, the best news you could possibly have. And that was seeing global population expand by 2% a year, some countries by 4% a year. Well, that's changed. We know all the population growth now is about people living longer. There are fewer and fewer children being born. More and more countries are falling into the low fertility zone. Now, how do we know that we're not all wrong? Well, there are two ways we could be wrong. One is all of a sudden, miraculously, fertility rates start recovering around the world. We all thought it was a perennial, long-term global issue, and alakazam, we're all back to 2 children per woman, 2 to 3 children per woman, and it all rights itself. And that could happen, but I see absolutely no indication to see that happening. Cases where the fertility rates recovered from very low rates are pretty small. Vanishingly few countries have gone below 2 and then back above 2. So I don't think we're going to see a great reversal. We might. The second is, we'll find a way around it. AI will be the solution, or goodness knows what will be the solution. And I'm very skeptical of all of that. I think we do need labor. I think AI can change the nature of the labor force, but can't substitute the need for labor. I don't think we're going to manage when we have one worker per retiree. So I neither think it's going to reverse itself, although I'd be delighted if I would prove wrong on that, nor do I think we're going to find miraculous ways around it. I think we're going to find it very difficult to live with. So therefore, I think it's absolutely appropriate to point out that it is a problem, that we seem to be stuck with it, and we need to do something about it. And if we all turn out to be wrong, I'll be very happy eating my hat instead of living in an aging and disappearing world.
Great, Paul. And hopefully, your grandchildren, by the time you need their help, they'll be able to help you. So, right, okay. I'm now going to move to another question. So, this person says, increasing access to assisted reproductive technology by making it more affordable and extending access to non-traditional family units like single parents and same-sex couples. How do we reconcile this with fairly conservative views on the family in certain countries? Singapore, for example, takes the stance that children should only be born to two-parent married heterosexual couples. So I think they mean a single couple there. Yet they are facing a record total fertility rate low of 0.97. How do you propose that access to ART is extended in countries like this? Would ARTs even be the answer to increasing total fertility rate in such cases? So I think I'll go to you, Bob, because you're sort of looking at the global picture with the More Joy campaign. What do the IFFS think about these situations?
I think it was stated by Geeta that now it's recognized that having children, if you wish, is a human right, no matter what the circumstances are. If you are alone, if you are a same-sex couple, or if you're transsexual, it is a human right. So I think that's a very fundamental statement. And yes, but we lack data. But in my perception, what I see in my own country and around the world, that a greater proportion of ART is performed under those circumstances. You have clinics that only that don't treat heterosexual couples, infertile couples. They only treat single individuals and homosexual couples. So it is on the rise. We should understand that better. And yes, of course, that varies from country to country. There are still countries where IVF is only reimbursed if you are married, for instance, not even heterosexual and live as a heterosexual couple together. No, you have to be married. So yes, there are country to country difference, which we cannot solve. We can just try to understand why, and again, come with relevant information why this is the case and have it higher on the priority list. One issue that has not been mentioned, it relates to the previous question. Yes, overpopulation in parts of the world is still a problem. There are parts of the world where still, on average, 5 to 6 children are being born, the fertility rate. So yes, it is certainly important to focus on decreasing birth rates in some parts of the world, but indeed in many other parts it is the reverse now. So it's not one or the other. These two can exist next to each other.
Anybody else want to come in on that? No. Okay. So it's this. I'm trying to decide where to go now with the next questions. There's so many. But there seem to be quite a few on, I suppose concerns. I suppose so. Santanu Acharya has said the global population doubled from 2.5 billion in 1950 to 5 billion in 1987, a period of just 37 years, representing a rapid increase in a little more than one generation. This is the single most important factor why global warming is happening, and therefore we have to be cautious what we wish for. Just a comment, really, and a spanner in the works. But there have been a couple of other sort of comment and questions that have been a bit similar along those lines.
Could I comment, because we
Yes.
have discussed this extensively in our working group, and what people have insisted on saying, the part where of the world where now still many children are born, mainly sub-Saharan Africa, a fertility rate 5 to 6 per woman. They stated, and I found the literature later on, the pollution is not by these people. The pollution of the planet is in our overly populated Western society. So it's not a one-on-one relationship. I saw one paper that in sub-Saharan Africa, 240 children born in sub-Saharan Africa in any given country, they are responsible for the same amount of pollution as one individual born in the Western world. So you have to make a distinction here.
Yeah. Anybody else want to come in? I think there's a couple of sort of related, certainly one related comment. Many younger couples are not having children because they fear their child's flourishing and survival is questionable, given the possible human extinction in the near future, which seems somewhat depressing. And then another one, yeah, I'll come to the panel. I'll just read this other one as well. To what extent is uncertainty and grimness in the news discouraging people from having children? People in earlier generations had children during all sorts of war and upheaval and strife, but they weren't spending all their time on gadgets, doom scrolling. So, Paul, do you want to come in on that first?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone's watched the various podcasts I've done and broadcasts I've done, and no reason to think you have, but for apologies for those who might have for repeating myself. I mean, the whole range of things you can say. First of all, that the world is fantastically better now for most people than it was when I was born, or when my parents were born, my grandparents. If the world is too bad to have children now, when we eat better, we live better, we live longer globally, then when we can't have children, why on earth did our parents have us? Why did our grandparents have our parents, and so on? So by so many measures of human welfare, life is better. That's no excuse not to have children, or no reason. And I think if we're getting ourselves into a doom loop that life is more and more miserable, how can I bring my children? I think that's an educational problem. I think if you are not having children because you want to save the planet, but you still expect a doctor to be at an appointment, a receptionist to be there, a bus driver, someone to fill the shelves at the supermarket, then all you're doing, instead, you're consuming the labour of others, you're refusing to produce it yourself. And therefore, you're just drawing people in from other parts of the world who have very low emissions to high emissions countries. Now, there are pros and cons of immigration. That's another debate. But don't think you're saving the planet if you're consuming the labour of others and you're not having children. You're just moving people from low emissions countries to high emissions countries. A baby born in Britain today has very low emissions. Babies don't really, the lifestyle doesn't really involve significant emissions until they're 20 odd, at which point, on the current basis, we'll be moving rapidly towards net zero. Young people are required to come up with the inventive solutions that are going to get us out of our environmental difficulties. So I could go on and on. There are so many good reasons to have children, and the environmental reasons not to have them, and the environmental reasons, the reason that the idea that the world's too awful to bring children into, these are completely spurious, and we need better education and better advocacy to get people out of this doomy mindset.
I can see I can see smiling faces from the other panelists, but I don't think that they want to come in. Okay, thanks, Paul, for taking that on. And I was just thinking back, gosh, my mother didn't have a washing machine until I was 16. It's a sort of, life was a lot harder for people. I think we quickly forget. So we've got a question from Ellie Lee, or it's a comment perhaps. This discussion has been happening for a long time, even if it's in the media more now. The proposition of a second demographic transition with delayed childbearing at the centre is 3 decades old. Comparisons with the 1960s are misleading because of the baby boom, as Paul explains in his book. Birth rates fell first from 1890. What is specific about the example the last 10 years or even this century? So Paul, I think that's perhaps a question for you from Ellie.
Well, I think what's specific is the fact that we have gone to such low fertility rates in so much of the world, that it's sub-replacement in so many places, that it's significantly low. It's not just sub-replacement, it's well below replacement. So the trend has continued. I think that's what's different. And the trend has gone to countries, as I've mentioned, Jamaica, I've mentioned Thailand, you could talk about Brazil, you talk about lots and lots of countries. We used to think that only when a country was developed would it get a very low fertility rate. And we're now finding that's not the case. India itself is going sub-replacement. That's not going to be a problem for India for a long time, but it's building the problem in. And what I talk about in my book is, or in various books, various places, and I'm working on a book at the moment about economics and demography, is people talk about the second demographic transition. So you go through the first one, which is, first of all, falling mortality rates, high fertility, population growth, and then eventually fertility falls and you stabilize at sort of 2 children per woman. The idea of the second demographic transition is you then inevitably go into super low fertility and the requirement for mass immigration, delayed fertility. My argument is that we're actually in a postmodern world. So it's not that we're determined to be low fertility. It's that material conditions which drove the transition, which constrained us in the Malthusian world and then constrained and then drove the transition. It's no longer about material. It's about your culture, your belief, your religion, your nationality, your nationalism. It's an ideological and cultural world we're now in that doesn't determine us necessarily to have low fertility. I think it was Lesteg and Van der Kar who came up with this idea of a second demographic transition. Actually, it's very, very Eurocentric. It's probably Belgiocentric. It's not the way the world is. The world is full of people who are choosing, who've come through the transition and are choosing to have large families, whether it's the Israelis or the Lutheran fundamentalists in Finland or the Calvinist fundamentalists in the Netherlands, or people in places like Montana as opposed to places like Vermont. There's lots and lots to learn about how in a postmodern world, when economics is no longer the constraint, people are making not low fertility choices, but very, very different fertility choices. And if we're going to get ourselves, what's new is that so many people are in that very, very low fertility space, as predicted by the second demographic transition. But we can actually learn something by looking at the exceptions. I think that's really important if we want to get ourselves out of these problems.
Geeta.
Well, that's brilliant, but isn't it also true that the implications of this demographic shift now is they are also more relevant because of longer life expectancy and better treatment? We have more aging society now, and with that aging population, the pressure on public services and pensions and the economy in general is a much bigger and newer problem compared to initial demographic shift. So the implications are quite different, and on nations' economies as well.
Right, I'm going to ask, I think, probably one more question, depending how quick the answers are. The answer is, so someone's asked, what information do we have about men choosing not to have children? We have a concern that the preliminary testing for male subfertility is in the UK is extremely poor in primary care with GPs, simply having none or little education on this topic. How do you feel we should be addressing the decline in male fertility? It's easy always to talk about women in this instance. Um, so I don't know who wants to go first on that. Perhaps Geeta and then Bart might come in because the IFFS have sort of
Well,
looked at
once
this.
again, my answer would be education. I think we need to just go back to that education bit. Bart and I were talking about introducing this education in secondary schools because that's where it's got to start if we want to improve that. But then, of course, having a male fertility investigations, all that is essential because we know a lot more now about the contribution of male subfertility to the problem and the need for IVF, and therefore, and the age as well, paternal age contributing to reduced outcomes. So education first, absolutely, and then improving healthcare for men and for male fertility.
Is there anything that you want to add to that, Bart? Yes.
Uh, I agree with everything with what Geeta has been saying, but I would like to emphasize one other issue, which I consider even more relevant. It is not just about male fertility, but it's also about male responsibility now as well. And therefore, I think the one who's raising the question, when you talk about having children, almost always 90% of the discussion is about women. And I can very well imagine that upsets quite a few women and say, this is not just our thing. This is not just it's related to men as well. And now I, as clinician, and I'm sure Geeta will have the same experience. It often you see relationships, once fertility is starting to become an issue, it changes the relationships, and sometimes people change partners. If and it's usually the woman who would like to have a child, and it doesn't happen not because she doesn't have a friend, but because the friends wants to postpone. So men should be much more aware and take responsibility. I hear women, in the Dutch on the news that they say, if they are on dating sites and if they are 30, they no longer mention their age because they say the first thing that men ask is, "Do you want to have children?" And if she says yes, then he's going to quit. He's going to disappear. So men should be educated, and men should be aware of this is not just a female thing.